All right. I think I'll be audible and much more clearer now. If there is any background noise, please let me some Ganesh Puja celebration going on outside. So there's a bit of noise, but I've put the noise cancellation thing on. Please continue solving, and I'll wait for a moment. Yashika Paridhi Riyasa, is there background noise? Thanks, Yashika. Please continue. Continue reading, everyone. All right. Is everyone done reading? That's ample time for reading a passage of this length. Like I said, it's 520 odd words. Around 3.5 minutes is enough reading time for us. Um, okay. So now I just want to go back to what I told you initially, which is I want us to maintain this sort of method of solving, and make sure that we are executing it in a very specific way. The reason why I'm telling you this again is the moment we set a timer, we have a tendency to return to our intuitive reading process. But that's not exactly what the exam wants, right? We are reading specifically for the exam, which means we need to figure out the main point of the author with absolute clarity, right? To do that, we don't need to get caught up in the unnecessary noise, right? Which is extra information. We don't need to focus on this. We need to focus on this, right? uh, we need to make sure that we aren't retaining or memorizing any information. Remember that the location of information naturally gets stored in our mind, right? Suppose I told you the word Beethoven, right? You know where this is located in the passage, right? You have a clear idea where this is located. If I was to mention something, let's say IP, you know where in the passage, generally speaking, where is located. Correct? So don't retain information. Whenever a question related to something comes, you can go back to the passage and check, right? And focus on why the author took up our time. So I'll do that for a few of the paragraphs, and then we'll see what the topic is, what about the topic the author has said, right? And so on and so forth. Just give me one moment, right? So notice here what I mean by in the reread, I'll simplify this. In the reread, I'll read it like, because neither memory banks nor representations exist in the brain. Uh, all that is required for us to function is brain to change in an orderly way, right? So there is no reason for any two of us to have the same experience, right? So the author is saying there's nothing recorded in my mind. My brain needs to change for me to function in the world. So there is no reason any two of us will function or change in the same way. Correct. So the first paragraph so far is being given to tell me there's no memory recording and none of us experience thing in the same way. This point is repeated again. So if you notice, I went through a long sentence and then I selectively reread. Right. This is important. Selectively reread. What is going to happen, and the reason why I went back to the reading process was what happens is that if there is a timer, you're going to reread the sentence start to end. Most of y'all are going to read the sentence from start to end, word by word, twice, right, or thrice. That doesn't always help. You have to make sure that you'll read selectively in the second or the third instance, right? Okay. In the next sentence, if you and I attend the same concert, the changes that occur in my brain when I listen to Beethoven's Fifth will almost certainly be completely different from the changes that occur in your brain. So the author is explaining this in the next sentence. So notice what I'm doing. I'm reading it and I'm figuring out why the author spoke to me. The author is explaining what happened in the first sentence. Those changes, whatever they are built on unique neural structure that already exists, each structure having developed over a lifetime of unique experiences. So all of us so far are unique, our experiences are unique, and there's nothing recording the memory in our minds. That's why the first paragraph was given. Correct? If you notice, the second paragraph in its entirety is an example, right? The example is to show no two people will repeat a story they have heard the same way and why, right? This is explained throughout this paragraph. So I'm only focused on why the second paragraph was given. It was to give me an example, right? So this is after I've read the paragraph, by the way, that I know that this was the explicit purpose behind the paragraph. Similarly, the next paragraph is to tell us what happens because of this thing, which is that all of us have unique experiences, all of us have unique changes in our minds because there is nothing called memory, right? This is why the first two paragraphs were given to us. The third paragraph tells us this introduces a difficulty in the lives of neuroscientists, right? Because for any given experience, orderly change could involve a million neurons, right? So how is it that a neuroscientist is going to map this change? So the third paragraph, the why of the third paragraph is to tell us that neuroscientists are in a difficult quandary or are in a difficult situation because of this thing, which is our brains have unique characteristics and they don't record experiences, so on and so forth, right? Then in the next paragraph, the author tells us worse still, if we had this ability to snapshot all of the brain's 86 billion neurons. So this entire paragraph is to tell us that this IP metaphor, which is the human brain functioning like a computer, has distorted our thinking of human function, right? This is confused us about how human brains function or how humans function, right? And also, the author tells us again, this adds to the task of neuroscientists becoming difficult, right? This is why the third paragraph was given. This adds to this because a snapshot of the brain's current state might also be meaningless unless we knew the entire life history of the brain's owner, right? So again, I'm more focused on why this information is given, right? I'll just mark it in as few words as possible, right? And here, memory banks don't exist, and no reason for us to have same experiences, correct? So just the words which I've circled for to highlight all of y'all, this is what the author is, Akant, that's what I'm trying to describe the reading process furthermore. And actually, uh, there are a few difficulties for me to describe the reading process because it happens in my head, and for you to change it because of the same reason. It happens in your head, and more important, you've been reading for 20 years in this fashion, so you have to change it specifically for the exam, right? Okay. So, Akant, what you do is overall, in the rereading of the sentence, in the rereading of the paragraph, you have to ask why the author gave you the information and not what. Okay. And the last paragraph then tells us we are organisms, not computers. Get over it. Uh, let's get on with business of trying to understand ourselves. For the IP metaphor, we should delete. Okay. So now that I've told you what the author's topic and what about the topic the author is trying to say, let's try and summarize this idea using by filling these blanks. I've already filled these blanks. I just want to wait a moment. I'll show you the passage again. I want all of you all to think what you'll put in place of blank A, what you'll put in place of blank B. You don't necessarily have to type it. I'll show it to you, but let's check against what you've done versus what I've written down. All right. So figure out what you think blank A is, what do you think the topic of the passage is, right? And what about the topic is the author saying, right? Putting these two facts together, we are going to get the main point of the author. So some of you may want to, all right, Akant, I'll try and answer that question shortly. Okay, so let's see what I've reduced this to about the topic. The topic is the brain's functioning, right? The reason why I know the topic is the brain's functioning is here is to tell us that our nothing, no memory thing exists in the brain. Our brain changes, right? And each change based on each person is unique, correct? That's what the second paragraph tells us as well, right? Just repeats, right? Third paragraph tells us this makes it difficult for a neuroscientist to, check what a million neurons are doing, correct? So again, we are talking about the process of the brain, the function of the brain, correct? So the topic is the brain's functioning. About the topic, the author is saying each brain is unique. So the IP metaphor distorts our understanding of how brains process information. Correct. Now, I know there may be a few differences in what you felt the this part is supposed to be, right? But the topic of the brain is firmly fixed, which is the brain's functioning. Okay. You might want to add a few more words to this, right? Maybe you felt you should say how there is nothing called memory. Maybe you should talk about how all of us uh, change our brains according to things which happen. So all of these things are not present in this, but these you could have added and they would be valid. Okay. Okay. So this is what the topic is. This is what the author wants to say categorically about the topic of the author. All right. I just want all of you all to read what I've marked here, but read it. Don't read the stuff in between. Just read the green parts, right? And this is what the selective reading process should look like. Okay. Please reread the parts I've marked again. I'll just wait for a moment. Akant, I'll address your doubts. But for a moment, everyone just go through these. All right. So if you notice again, this is how I would reread the passage. In my reread of the passage, I've skipped a lot of information, right? And I've simplified the passage. I know when the author is giving me an example to justify the first paragraph, right? This is the example to justify the first paragraph. Excuse me. This paragraph is to tell us how, because of this idea that all of us are unique, right? How each of us is truly unique, how the neuroscientist ka job becomes harder, correct? That same idea is repeated here. A snapshot of the brain's current state might also be meaningless unless we knew the entire history of that brain zone. Again, the neuroscientist job becomes more difficult. We are organisms, not computers. The IP metaphor, which is the human brain functioning like a computer, should be deleted, right? So the author wants to say that this idea of IP should be deleted. It distorts our understanding of how brains process information. All right. Okay. So now we'll move to the questions. Again, I want all of you all to keep this idea of the reading process in mind. And I want you to make a note of this before Akant, this applies to you, others also. Before any kind of question that you're going to read in the exam, I want you to keep this mindset sort of fixed in your head, right? Now let's think of a mindset on solving questions. Okay, remember this. First one, always specific word or phrase for a specific decision. Meaning, if you have four options, if you're saying option D is incorrect, you should have a specific word or phrase which makes it incorrect. This word or phrase can be in the passage or it can be in the option, right? Same thing with option C, same thing with option B, right? And many times you'll be confused between two options. Then to select option A, even if there's something problematic stated in option A, you should have something in the passage which allows you to accept that, correct? So for any decision that I'm taking, which is eliminating an option or selecting an option, I have a specific word or phrase. Remember, I am not describing this to myself. If I describe stuff to myself, I'm going to make mistakes, right? Instead, I'm going to rely on the evidence provided by the author or by the examiner, right? So look for evidence. Go back to the passage to check word by word. Don't solve by memory, right? Don't solve by memory. Go back to the passage just like a bar graph. Look for the information in that passage and then solve. Use the structure of the passage. For example, if there's a question about this, if there's a question about this, I know why this information is given to me, right? So use that structure to navigate through the passage. Okay. I'll talk about this. And Akant, I'll also try and address what you said, how many passages to solve, so on and so forth in the exam. Right? First, let's start with a few questions. This is your first question. All of you all, please go through this. I'll wait for a moment and type in your answers when you're All right, which option would you all go with? Everyone, Akant, others, please participate. That way, that's the only way you'll be confident about selecting something, marking something in the exam. Which of the following can be inferred about the implications of the IP metaphor on neuroscience? Remember what I said? You have to locate the information in the passage, implications of the IP metaphor on neuroscience. About IP metaphor, the IP metaphor is the human brain functioning like a computer. Right? What has this IP metaphor done? It has distorted our thinking about human functioning. Correct? Computers store data. The brain maintains our intellect only as long as it remains alive. Correct? There's no off switch, etc. Okay, then again, in the end, the author says the IP metaphor should be deleted. Why? Because IP metaphor has produced few, if any, insights. Meaning, IP metaphor has been of not much value, right? Therefore, delete the IP metaphor. Now, the reason why I have to go back to the passage, of course, that's the process of solving questions, but for inferences, you need some information, opinion, etc., to make a fresh conclusion, right? That is what a inference is. Using information in the passage, we draw or we come up with something fresh. That's a fresh conclusion. Right? So I went back to the passage and I checked. Now let's go through each option word by word. The IP metaphor assists neuroscientists by offering a clearer framework to understand memory formation in humans. Now, assists neuroscientists is incorrect because we are told here IP metaphor has produced few insights, if any. Matlab, hardly it has not been of much help at all. Right? Second thing the author has said, there is no memory bank as such. Right? So to understand memory formation in the brain is a little bit problematic. But the most important reason is this word clearer does not apply because it hasn't provided any insights, right? So specifically for using the word clearer, option A is invalid. Let's look at option B. The IP metaphor fails because computers on-off states, right? So here we are told, then I'll go and check again what the author has said about computers going on and off. Computers store exact copies of data even if the power is turned off. There is no on-off switch in the brain. The brain keeps functioning or we disappear. Correct? So the IP metaphor fails because the computer's on-off states mimic the constant functionality required by brains. So this idea of mimicking, let's simplify the option two. I'm canceling all of these words. Okay? Computers mimic the brain, right? Let's just read it like this. Computers mimic brains. And then you'll know specifically for using the word mimic, option B is incorrect. Nowhere in the passage does the author say computers mimic the brain. Right? Mimic would be follow precisely what the brain is. Correct. So option B is incorrect for using the word mimic. Option A is incorrect for using the word clearer. Let's look at option D. The IP metaphor allows for a closer simulation of brain processes than any other scientific model available. Then any other scientific model available is incorrect. No other scientific model has been discussed in the passage so far. All right. So A is incorrect, B is incorrect, and D is incorrect. Let's look at option C. The IP metaphor oversimplifies the complexity of how brains process and store information over time. Right? If you notice what we had written here, the IP metaphor distorts our understanding of how our brains process information. Right? They make it, they oversimplify it. They treat it like uh, that vast pattern would mean nothing outside the body. The most egregious way, the human brain functioning like a computer. Right? So this idea is oversimplifying the complexity of how brains process and store information over time. Option C is the correct, clear choice. Is this clear, others? All right. So let's try and solve another question. The next question. I like everyone, those of you who are participating. I know the passages are slightly difficult, the questions are slightly difficult, but let's play along with this. The level of difficulty is based on the exam. So this challenge is expected. Let's let's see the next question, everyone. All right. I'll just wait. Please go through this and solve this. All right. So, which of the following examples of events accurately represents the orderly change referred to in the passage? Okay. Now, like I told you, first step, let's look for where orderly change is mentioned. Orderly change is mentioned here and it's mentioned somewhere else again, which is orderly change here, right? So, first, let's figure out what orderly change is saying here, then we'll look at the examples given, right? The author states about orderly change that there is no reason to believe that any two of us are changed by the same way. Uh, this orderly change happens, it's required for us to function in the world, correct? Uh, if you notice, this change is unique to each of us, right? This change is unique to each of us. Now, the author has explained this orderly change in the second paragraph. No two people will repeat a story they've heard the same way and why over time. See, to answer this question accurately, it's important for us to look at this, and then look at this, right? So that's what I'm trying to do here. In the second paragraph, the author has given us a clear example of how orderly change will work. Each individual, upon hearing the story, changes it to some extent. The individual changes to some extent, and uh, when asked about the story later on, they can re-experience hearing the story to some extent, although not well. Okay. And orderly change involves change in a million neurons, possibly the entire brain. All right. Now let's look at the examples provided here. Right. Let's start with option D. A runner, despite following the same training plan, experiences random fluctuations in performance on race. Now I feel option D was the easiest to eliminate because orderly and random opposite, right? So orderly change is not going to be random fluctuations caused in the brain of a person. So option D is invalid. Let's look at option B. A chess player replays a match, but his memory of the moves shifts unpredictably. Another way to say random, correct? Shifts unpredictably is basically another way to say random. By the way, please reduce your volume. I might be screaming because of the noise outside. So anyway, please adjust it at your end. Shifts unpredictably is another way to say random, so therefore invalid. Correct. We are looking for something that will mark a orderly change in someone. Right. So B and D, for specific reasons, we have marked it as invalid. Let's look at option C. After reading the same story, two children's recollections. Right. So this is about reading the same story. Their recitations of the story will diverge more and more, correct, become increasingly divergent and inconsistent over the years. Right now, let's put this option aside. Okay. Now, remember, this is going to happen in the exam. Right. You're going to get four options, maybe option C and D. 90% of us will eliminate this, saying these are very easy to eliminate. In these options, you'll be confused. Then you need, like I told you, it's very important for me to have specific words or phrases to take these decisions. These words could be in the passage or these words could be in the options, right? We have to use this in a much more precise way now. All right. So let's take a look at this. After reading the same story, the two children's recollections become increasingly divergent, right? So this would mean these two children, let's say X and Y, hear the same story at this point in time. As time progresses, each starts to diverge from the original story, and it becomes increasingly divergent, right? It becomes more and more different. So this tells me, let's say that a person heard a story in the year 2000. In the year 2024, it will be at max divergent position, right? Maximum possible divergent position. This is what the words increasingly divergent would mean. This is not exactly what is stated here. Let's look at option A. We are comparing option C to option A. After repeated practice, it improves subtly but consistently, right? So this pianist is improving very slightly. The improvement is very slight and barely noticeable, though her performances still vary each time. So notice that she's practicing, she's improving slightly. There is some variation, there is some diverging from the original, diverge from original, right? So there is some diverging from the original by saying varying. So diverge slightly. But this is not the same as saying increasingly divergent, right? So option A is the correct choice and not options B, C, and D. All right. These words make options B, C, and D incorrect. Is this clear? I suspect many of you would have gone with option C in this case. Some of you would have gone with option B as well. But this is the right choice. Is this clear to everyone? Can we see the next question? Great. All right. So please start with this. I'll just wait for a moment. Others, type in your answers, please. What do you think is the answer for this? All right. Others, type in your answers. Right. I just want all of you all to make a note of this statement that I've written down. A valid assumption is necessary for the passage to be true. Right? Keep this idea in mind. I'll explain it as we proceed through the options. let's read the question first. Which of the following assumption is not required for the author to establish that the brain is different from the computer? Which of the assumptions is not required? This tells us there are three valid assumptions and one invalid assumption, which we need to capture, right? This should be our answer. Okay. So now and this is to check the passage that we have to refer to. The part of the passage that we have to refer to is the part which establishes that the brain is different from the computer, right? So this part of the passage we are specifically focused on. So let's look at option A, right? And one moment, let me erase these things. Okay. So we are looking for an invalid assumption, right? So first, let's look at option A. And option A says the brain's neural changes depend on personal experiences, unlike computers, which store identical copies of data. Right? So option A is a valid assumption. We can go through the passage and we can find how computers store identical copies of data. We can go in the passage and we can find how brains changes depend on personal experiences. This is the first paragraph. The second half of the option is in this paragraph. So we know that the information is there in the passage. But go back to what I'd written here. A valid assumption is necessary for the passage to be true. So I can check the validity of option A very easily. All I have to do is I have to say the brain's neural changes don't depend on don't depend on personal experiences, unlike computers which store. So if I say don't depend on personal experiences, you know this is invalid, right? And therefore the passage would become invalid. So we know option A is definitely a valid assumption. So to check whether a valid assumption is truly valid, in short, what I want you to do from the statement that I told you, a valid assumption is necessary for the passage to be true. What I want you to do is when you think an assumption is valid, such as option A, try putting the word not in or don't in this case. And if the passage stops making sense, then you know option A is a valid assumption. We'll try that for option B. The brain's continuous functioning is not essential for memory retention. But we are told here brain maintains our intellect only as long as we are alive. So if I add the word not here, this would stop making sense. So that means a valid assumption is necessary for the passage to be true. Right? So option B also valid assumption. Right? Now let's look at option C. So A and B are valid assumptions, they aren't our answers. Let's look at option C. Simulating brain activity in a computer would fail without understanding the individual's life history and social context. So would not fail. तो इसको let's say would succeed. राइट यहाँ पे मैंने नॉट लगाया था या डोंट लगाया था, यहाँ पे भी मैंने नॉट इसेंशियल लगाया था, यहाँ पे फेल तो ऑलरेडी इज नॉट और नेगेटिव, सो आई एम मेकिंग इट द ऑपोजिट ऑफ दैट, आई एम सेइंग सक्सीड. So simulating brain activity in a computer would succeed without understanding the individual's life history and social context. This is opposite of what is being stated here, right? Meaningless unless we know entire life history. So ये succeed होता तो this would have become incorrect. So A, B, and C are valid assumptions. Option D is an invalid assumption. A brain can store large amounts of information without the need for continuous structural changes over time. We are told here each time for us to function, each time something happens, a change takes place in an orderly way, right? And this change continues to take place, right? The recitations of story will diverge more and more. So the change is constantly taking place. So brain can store large amounts of information, but it needs continuous structural change, right? So without the need is invalid. Option D is the correct choice here, right? Is this clear to everyone? Many of you have gotten this right, I see, but I'm hoping this is clear to everyone. Let's see the next one. This is the last question, and then I have a few doubts that I want to discuss. Please go through this. This is the final question from the passage, and then I'll discuss two doubts. All right, that's absolutely right. So Yashika has spotted the error and the reason behind it. We'll go through these possible summaries, right? So there are three possible summaries and one invalid summary. We need to identify the invalid one. Option A says the brain functions through individualized dynamic changes, so unique experiences, orderly changes. Correct. Contrasting sharply with computer-like data storage. Computers uh, have unchanged data over a long period of time. They save data, right? So option A is a possible, somewhat of a possible summary. So this is not something that the author would disagree with. So not our answer. Option B, the IP metaphor distorts our understanding. Right? This is stated in the passage. Distorted our thinking of the brain's processes, as the brains do not store exact copies of data. So again, not a great summary, but acceptable somewhat, right? Nothing wrong with option B. Let's look at option D. The brain's continuous functioning and experiential adaptability highlight the flaws in comparing it to static computational models. We are organisms, we are not computers, right? So it's a flaw to compare the brain to static computers. Right? So A, D are somewhat acceptable summaries. Part which makes option C incorrect is the second part of option C. Although the brain's adaptability makes it different from computers, correct? It is different from computers. This part is correct. The IP metaphor still holds some useful insights. What did the author say about the IP metaphor? IP metaphor should be deleted. So, still useful is something the author will disagree with. Option C is the clear choice in this case. All right. So I'm hoping this question was clear to everyone. All right. So just a quick overview. Very important parts of the class are you keeping in mind why this is important for us to follow to improve our accuracy for questions, and why this is important for you to follow for maintaining your clear method of reading. So Akant had asked about the reading process. Akant, please go through the prior 6 classes which I've conducted. I continuously talk about the reading process, and I talk about it in a way in which you can make a method out of it. You can structure it such that your overall, like over time, your ability to get better at it will improve. Make sure that while you're doing the reading process in a time bound fashion in the exam, right, which is a mock test, some kind of a sectional test, so you're using a timer. So make sure you do this while using a timer, but very important that you should practice this without a timer as well, right? This is really important at the start because you want to develop this reading process first and then practice it under duress or under pressure, right? So work on this reading process without a timer first, and then try and apply it with a timer. And you have to do these things simultaneously, of course. You with timer and without timer. Don't say, "Okay, I'll first practice for the first 2 months without timer and then with timer." It doesn't make sense. But I'm saying do a separate practice of each. I hope that's clear so far, Akan. Uh, the other thing that I wanted to mention, which was Akan's doubt, which is you know how many passages to solve, how many PA questions to solve in the exam. So this is there are two questions that students ask: how many time per, how much time per questions, and how many questions total, right? And different people will give you different answers about this, but I'll tell you something very honestly and frankly: this changes from paper to paper, right? Go and try solving the 2008 CAT paper, right? And use the same timelines that everyone tells you, right? Let's say for the entire solving process, let's say try and solve it in 1 hour, right? The verbal section then used to be like about 1 hour, right? And take 2 minutes per question. You'll find it very hard to do for the 2008 paper and the 2006 paper, especially. And that's because these things change from paper to paper. There's also another factor, it changes from student to student. Okay. So I know this doesn't directly answer your doubt, Akan. What I want you to first start by doing is develop an optimum solving attempt that you do for yourself, right? Which is to maintain, speed and accuracy have an inverted relationship. You try and solve something too fast, and your accuracy will reduce. And if you try to be really accurate and solve it really slowly, your accuracy can be quite high, but then your attempt reduces, right? So you have to find that sweet spot and find the right balance. So for now, I would suggest try and target 3 RCs and at least 50% of your VA questions, right? Try and set this as and I use the word very loosely here, try and set this as the somewhat ideal target, okay? And make sure that you're trying to achieve this, optimally, solve it too fast. So set this as the target first. And then as the exam comes close, I'm hoping that each of you will have their own individual strategy. Some of you may want to solve all VA questions first and then the RCs. Some of you may want to solve RCs first and then VA. But that strategy is individual and specific from student to student. That you can develop for yourself only if you do enough practice, right? Okay. So, to score 15 marks. Okay, so I think I've addressed it overall. Others also, by the way, I try and cover this reading process in detail. So if you have any doubts, if you have any suggestions, ways to improve the class, comments and actually address them in the next class like I've done in the prior classes. So that's it for today. I'll bring today's class to an end, everyone. I hope it was productive for you, and I want to make sure that in the next class also I'll cover a similar RC. So if you have any suggestions, do send them in the comments. And so thank you, for logging in. Initially, there some audio issues, so thank you for being patient, and see you in the next class. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.